Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Black Women's Blueprint and the National Organization for Women for the third in our series, 100 Days of a Feminist Agenda, Healing from Centuries of Oppression. This week, our conversation is entitled A Holistic Approach to Equitable Reproductive Health. And as folks continue to join the Zoom, we invite you to let us know in the chat box where you're joining us from. And while you do that, I just wanted to, and our panelists and hosts join us as well on video, some basic housekeeping. We will be doing our best to keep the conversation to 1 hour. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of the hour, and we'd love to hear from all of you, please. Any questions you have for our panelists. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom, and use the chat box for your comments and reflections on the conversation. We really appreciate all of your comments and reflections. It's important to us. Please understand we try our best to answer as many questions as possible, but we're also trying to balance the time we have together. All of our events are ASL accessible, and I'd like to thank our ASL translators, Santana Chavez and Alex Luce from RGC Access. And with that, I'd like to welcome one of our co-moderators, Savannah Brown, to introduce the afternoon.
Greetings and welcome, everyone. It is such a pleasure to welcome each and every one of the advocates, activists who's on the line. My name is Savannah Brown. I am the co-executive director at Black Women's Blueprint, and I am zooming in today from Michigan, and it is snowy and it's beautiful and spring is trying to show itself. And I want to recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations and acknowledge our Native nations as we move into this conversation, as we have Tewa women in the house. Our historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, and also Indigenous individuals and communities who are here now, right? And while whose land was taken from under them, are still incredibly powerful communities who fight for dignity, right? Every single day. I also want to name, while we have in our own voice, the Black RJ Collective here with us, that it is also Black History Month, right? And we are in our final conversation with the National Organization for Women that will be held in this very sacred and special month, Black History Month. And the specific conversation that we're having today around reproductive health and justice, and how critical that conversation is to Black women in terms of the right to body sovereignty that is so steeped in our historical narratives. And we could go on and on about those historical narratives. But that body sovereignty that we ground our work in is really a nod, specifically for Black women, for the ways in which our bodies have been seen as properties of the state, properties of state slaveholders, where our bodies were traded for crops and coins and other goods, And we were seen only as cattle, right? Historically, and even now in the contemporary scene, as 3/5 of human. And fighting for body sovereignty calls for this mandate around reparations and justice and what is owed to Black women. And as the Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was convened by Black women, by Black Women's Blueprint, we seek to name the ways in which our bodies, from a reproductive justice framework, were treated and herded as products of the state, right? In 1662, the General Assembly of Virginia decreed that any child born to an enslaved woman would also be a slave. So not just our bodies as Black women and the history around that, but our children as well. And so on this Black History Month, so important to name that when we are fighting for body sovereignty, we are also fighting against the results of that middle passage in the transatlantic slave trade, and when our bodies were for sale and forcibly bred. And we're fighting for the control of our bodies. So I'm excited about tonight's conversation, where we have the context of body sovereignty really as the bedrock of this conversation, to honor our Indigenous communities and our Black communities. And I'm so honored to invite everyone into this conversation with that in mind. And so with gratitude, I want to hand it over, and I'm honored to introduce our co-moderator, Annette Bethel, who is the president of the South Carolina chapter of NOW, and who will join me in facilitating this conversation. And Annette, so glad to have you. Welcome. Can we hear Annette? Annette is on mute, I see.
I'm sorry, this has been a rough day. I'm also president of the Columbia chapter now. We restarted 2 years ago. And I'm happy to be here and listening to everyone. And I am just very excited because as you well know, that South Carolina did the S1 bill. It went to court. We have a 14-day injunction. And it's very scary times in South Carolina because we have some other bills as well. And, under the Trump administration, it's been the past 4 years, we've had advances in the past decades of our Black, Indigenous, women of color, Latinx, trans, and gender nonconforming relatives have under great threat of regression. Hopefully with the Biden administration, we will see some kind of codifying of laws so we won't have to go to court, and that more women will be able to access safe health care. I am very hopeful at this point, but again, I live in South Carolina, but southern states. So y'all, we need help down here. Y'all need to hurry. And I'm gonna turn it over to Savannah again.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you named it, right? The Biden-Harris administration has committed to uplifting our voices, right? But we know there is so much that needs to be done, and that can truly make a difference at the grassroots level in our lives, in our communities, and in the lives of those that we serve and that we work with daily. And this is why beginning these first 100 days, right, with this feminist agenda and this conversation in the new administration, it's important that we also continue this throughout 2021, right? We are bringing these voices to the forefront. We're bringing the concerns of South Carolinians and Atlanteans and right all over the country, the Northeast, Southwest, all over the country, bringing those voices to the forefront so we can share our perspectives, our experiences. We can highlight how we've been deeply personally impacted, and what issues matter most to us. And that is why the National Organization for Women and Black Women's Blueprint have come together to create this space where our intersectional and radical feminism can be alive in action, right? So we can have this discussion, but we can also talk about what are the next steps. These are listening sessions, but we also want to bring them to action. We hope that this series, as we move into this conversation and those thereafter, will help organizations as well solidify the priorities of this feminist agenda of the first 100 days of this administration, right? And so we'll be putting together a toolkit that will be shared so that folks can also engage on an action-based level. And I want to bring in our speakers tonight and our panelists. I'm excited to introduce you all and just share who you are, just a slice of who you are, right? Because I can speak to you as individuals, but I will read your bios just really briefly. Marcella Howell, who is the founder and executive director of In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, has advocated for women's rights, reproductive health and justice, and women's empowerment for over 40 years, and is the author of Walk in My Shoes, a Black activist guide to surviving the women's movement, a collection of inspirational essays to help young Black women navigate the women's movement and empower them to become leaders in the fight for reproductive justice. And I know Marcella. Marcella is incredibly fierce and powerful and makes things happen. So I'm excited to have you tonight. Dr. Corinne Sanchez of San Ildefonso Pueblo is Executive Director of Tewa Women United, located in New Mexico, which provides services, education, and community for Native women and youth. She is trained in sexual assault prevention, educational awareness, advocacy, and trauma-informed care, and has worked in the sexual violence field for over 20 years. Most recently, Ms. Sanchez has been selected to serve on the governor of New Mexico's Advisory Council on Racial Justice. Welcome, Corinne. I am so excited to have you here and to hear just all that you are bringing to this conversation, so welcome. Jessica Lujan is the Indigenous Women's Health and Reproductive Justice Program Manager at Tewa Women United. So Tewa is representing. She has been working with Tewa Women United since 2010 as a community doula. We're going to talk about what that is and why that's integral to our movement. A childbirth educator, a certified lactation educator, and in her current position since 2015. Jessica is a passionate advocate for reproductive and birth justice, and has made it her mission to provide compassionate and culturally appropriate doula care to the families in her community. As you can see, we have advocates in the room from the policy level to the on-the-ground level to service-driven work. And I know we have some really great questions for them. And Annette, I want to pass it over to you to let's get in this conversation. Let's start this dialogue and see where we can go, and inviting our community to put questions in the chat along the way. Annette?
Hey, y'all, it's me again. And let's just start off with something very basic, but crucial to our discussion. What is the difference between reproductive rights, reproductive freedom, and reproductive justice? And why are these distinctions important? Also, can you speak to some current legislation or policies that are helping to advance reproductive justice?
It'd be great to hear Marcella, if you could answer that question, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Thank you very much, Savannah and Annette. And I want to say I am really happy to be here. Anytime Savannah sends me an email and saying, can you do? My answer is always yes. You know, I love Black Women's Blueprint and have been working with them for a lot of different kind of co-events, and it's just my pleasure to be here. So reproductive rights, reproductive freedom, and reproductive justice. So I can put this in a little a simple framework. Reproductive rights and reproductive freedom deal with the womb, in all honesty. Reproductive rights is the legal right to abortion, the legal right to birth control, the legal right to have control over your own body. Reproductive freedom is healthcare for the most part, access to abortion, access to family planning, access to making decisions about when and how you grow your family. Reproductive justice, on the other hand, is a little bit broader than that. It does take into the impact of being able to control your own body, but it also is, reproductive justice is based in human rights to control not just our bodies, but our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. And we believe In Our Own Voice that that right can only be achieved when all women and girls have the complete economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives. As a reproductive justice organization, we approach our issues from a human rights perspective incorporating the intersections of race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and gender identity with the situational impacts of economics, politics, and culture that make up the lived experiences of Black women in America. And our long-term vision for our work is an innovative collaboration to use leadership development, advocacy, and policy change and movement building strategies to build a powerful and sustainable network of Black women activists. So in that sense, I should say that our organization works with 8 partner reproductive justice organizations, and based in, and I have to say them all, I have to shout out to each and every one of them. Black Women for Wellness in California, Black Women's Health Imperative, which is a national organization, New Voices for Reproductive Justice, which is in Pennsylvania and Ohio, Sister Love in Georgia, Sister Reach in Tennessee, Spark Reproductive Justice Now, also in Georgia, the AFIA Center in Texas, and Women with a Vision in Louisiana. These are our partners. We are a national state partnership so that we do things together. Each of our partner organizations have their own 501c3, they're their own nonprofits. They work on a variety of issues, and we come together with them when we are trying to influence policy at the federal and at the state level, as well as when we're just trying to mobilize people to use our power, primarily in voting these days. And so our vision is that to really mobilize Black women voters across the country to essentially change policy, to shift the policy to being something that is proactively supportive of how we live our lives.
Wow. I mean, you gave us so much in that response, right? And I think what is particularly compelling about this conversation, and we'll get to this a little bit later, is that there is the Black reproductive justice movement at this conversation, and also the Native women's reproductive justice movement in this conversation. And we arrive at our definitions of reproductive justice from different vantage points. And it's just critical, right, that you name these collaborators and these partners in this broader ecosystem of the Black RJ movement who are moving work across the country. And so thank you for giving us the definition and also breaking it down for us in that way. And, you know, I want to turn to Corinne to just ask you also, right, how you think that Native reproductive justice organizing is represented right now in the mainstream and being articulated, what the current state of Native and Indigenous women's reproductive justice work is, and what the responsibility of the community is, right, in relationship to your work.
Wow. Thank you, Marcella, for that great overview of our journey. And I feel like this is our journey to that reproductive liberation that we all want to get to, and the touching stones that we need to do that. So starting from our physical self all the way into the spiritual realms that connect us as peoples, as Indigenous peoples to this land, to our home bases. I come from Pohoge Owinge, Naokua Pepoviomu, so I come from my ancestral homelands. And really that body sovereignty that we're talking about, that self-determination, you know, started back in 1492 when the first contact came upon our lands here, and how that has impacted us as Indigenous women through our lifespan, through our lifetime, through generations. So we're really talking about that historical trauma, that intergenerational trauma, and then that individual complex trauma that is our journey as individuals and as community and as peoples connected by the land, air, and water in which we find ourselves responsible for, no matter where we're at, no matter who we are. So we're multicultural, multiracial communities and organizations. And I think it's important for us as Indigenous peoples to be able to name our story, to be able to tell our story, to be able to share our story in those different formats. And we're coming to this historical moment right now in this country to have a South Asian Black woman in one of the highest seats, to have the potential to have a Native American person, and in this particular situation, a Native American woman, and in particular, a Pueblo woman, to be looked upon for a cabinet position in this country. And so when we talk about the violence and the history for us around reproductive liberation is about really recognizing and understanding that the seeds for all of us were planted generations and generations ago. And it's our responsibility for those seeds into the future, for those yet to come, those yet we have yet to know, to be able to be the strong advocates on whatever level that is for us, if it's on a personal level to an international level. And as Indigenous peoples, our reproductive health and liberation comes at all of those levels. When we look at women and we're healing ourselves through our interpersonal violences and traumas, to then be able to speak and reach those international bodies that are making decisions around reproductive choices for peoples across the globe, that we need to be educated and understand all of our pathways and how we came to this place where we as women across the globe are seen as body parts, are objectified, are dehumanized on a large scale. And sexual violence is just one particular way that this culture of violence manifests itself. And how do we as communities heal and transform that? And so being able to, again, as Indigenous people, tell our story, how we're connected to our land base. For us, Naochokwiyo is our mother. She gives us the gifts that we are responsible for taking care of all of our health, all of our peoples. And so I think that's the lens from which we as Indigenous peoples continue to advocate on our local scale to an international scale around the protection, around climate justice, around our body sovereignty as individuals and women in our homes, in our spaces, in our communities, in general across the globe. We join others to do that. And so our circles for that, because we are only 1% of the population, 10% in some states, a little bit lower in others, that we're still having to maintain those relational activities with others to help uplift our voice. We wouldn't get to the place we're at with missing and murdered Indigenous women without the support of all communities lifting us up in different ways, but in particular for our Native women, our Indigenous women, to share their stories with courage and vulnerability, to make sure that we're not forgotten, our relatives are not forgotten, and that those things still continue to threaten us. And that's what we ask from the greater community across this globe and in this country, to recognize and heal those wounds that we all have deeply, that we need to transform the systems that are currently in existence, and that we collectively continue to dream into existence better, more transformative, more inclusive systems to respond and hold us, our relatives into the future and those in the past, and to know that that is possible, that we can do this, that we are doing this, and that is continuing to happen in our Indigenous communities and in our relatives across the world. Thank you.
Beautiful. I mean, I know Annette is coming with another question that I know will bring Jessica into this conversation. And there exists this overlap, right, between the Black and Indigenous RJ movements around what is sacred to us, right, that is connected to our land, that is connected to all elements, the past and present, right, like the historical, how we've been impacted by colonization and white supremacy, right? And how we have organized our birth work and our reproductive justice to be incredibly responsive to that, and to be responsive to reclaiming what belongs to us, which is our sovereignty and dignity, right? And that which is sacred. So thank you, Corinne.
I'm so sorry. I was so mesmerized by our speakers. I forgot to ask the question. I've been planning and having a little garden in the back and planting my seeds, and really it's self-care and connecting back to the earth. And so I think the question for Jessica is a form of reproductive health care that's really important to both Black and Indigenous people are the doula services. And what are doula services and why they're so important? And do you think they should be more integrated into mainstream reproductive health care?
Thank you, Annette, and thank you, Corinne and Marcella. Before I start to talk about what doula care is, like maybe we could just practice together. Maybe we could all just take a deep collective breath to take in the words that were just shared with us by Corinne and Marcella, because to me, that's prayer. Those words are prayer, and that's a good place to start and the foundation of where we are and where we're going. So if we could just take a deep breath in through our nose and out through our mouth. And we start there. As doulas, we start with the very first, right? The breath, the place where our babies take that first breath in, where our parents bring them to their chest. That's where our work begins. And, you know, there's a lot of different definitions of doulas. The basic definition is somebody who supports a pregnant person through emotional, physical, educational support. We provide advocacy. We provide referrals to resources. In many of our communities, doulas have been around forever, right? They're the sisters, they're the aunties, the wise women in our communities. And so even though this word doula is relatively new, the act of what we do is not. It's forever. And so in our program, we named our program Iavi Kagindi, which is Tewa for helper of the mother. And it is that recognition of that role that is traditional, that role that has always been in our communities. The question about why doula services are important, they're important for lots of reasons. We know that doulas can help to decrease preterm birth rates, low birth rates, and cesarean rates. We know that having a doula at your birth can help to increase the likelihood of having a vaginal birth. You're more likely to be able to feed your baby with human milk, so lactation rates increase and lactation duration increases. We know that having doulas contributes to birth equity across communities, both locally and nationwide. And we know that kind of in the larger scheme of it all, having a doula is actually increases cost savings for institutions, for hospitals, for organizations, and for individuals. Should doulas be incorporated more into mainstream reproductive care? I think doulas are there regardless. I think it's about whether or not our institutions are going to be recognizing that and compensating doulas for their work. There's a huge amount of conversation happening nationwide around Medicaid reimbursement for doula care. We know that some states have enacted laws to allow doulas to be reimbursed through Medicaid. And for some folks, that works really well. And for others, we've seen a lot of challenges around that. Our program did release a report called Birth Equity in New Mexico. And I do believe that they are going to be putting a link to that report in the chat. So we do definitely ask you all to take a peek at that, where we can link together our work with Black Women's Blueprint and have that conversation around what doula care is, how doulas can be reimbursed, and the different ways that doulas can impact our families and our communities.
Thank you. I think you gave us a lot with your embodied work, right? And teaching us the ways in which we get to internalize and integrate into our bodies this work happens not just on a policy level and not just on an advocacy level, but it happens on a very real and body oriented and somatic level. And so when Marcella gives us this definition of reproductive justice and freedom that is steeped in our very, very lived experiences. And Corinne, you teach us, right, the ways in which we are a part of a greater ecosystem of life and life way, right? I believe, Jessica, you just tied that in for us with an embodied practice and a naming that the work that we do, again, is divine and sacred. And so you presented, I think, the tension between mainstreaming our work, right? Like we want to see doulas in legislation, and we want to see doulas in bills, and we want to see birth work and all of these different kinds of things like represented on a mass scale. But we also want to preserve, right, what is ours and what is belonging and what is ancient and what is tradition for us. So I think there's a lot to grapple with, and we're in a very unique position, especially as COVID is a political issue. COVID is a legislative issue, right? Everything down to like the vaccine and stimulus. All of these things to me are reproductive justice agenda items. Whether people can access healthy foods or a place to lay their heads down or raise their children or birth their babies, these are deeply political issues, and they are bound up in our lived and bodily experiences as well. And so where I want to take us, just, to open up this dialogue and conversation, is to talk about where we believe, because I do see the synergies, that Black RJ movements and Native RJ movements work together, right? Where is that overlapping, and where have we yet actually to collaborate, right? What is in your wildest imagination possible in our collaboration and our work with each other, understanding these overlapping histories and also these overlapping strategies to how we respond to crisis. And as we build this conversation, this will be the more fluid and open part of our dialogue. I just want to remind us to, on a logistical standpoint, to speak slowly to one another for our interpreters, who are doing a brilliant job of making this conversation accessible. And while we can get very passionate, excited, to speak slowly and to invite as much access as possible to the conversation. So I'll just repeat: how can Black RJ and Native RJ movements collaborate? And what in your imagination does working together look like? And any of you can answer or start us off.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that what we heard from Corinne is a starting point when she talked about the land and how we perceive that is our own community, our own living space and things. Reproductive justice, because we talked about it in its wider, broader meaning, environmental justice, climate justice is really important. And one of the things that we've been doing a lot of work on this past year is looking at water issues and heat issues. And I think that what people don't quite understand, if you look at Black communities and how Black communities have been set up, primarily because of how they've been destroyed as we sort of move to a new highway system and education system, that very often, like the highways that we have right now in our country, went through the homes, basically, of Black and Indigenous people, just simply wiped them out because someone said we need a highway this way. And one of the things that we were able to do is to talk to the new Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, about this whole idea of infrastructure and how do you repair infrastructure in a way that has both a racial and gender lens, an equitable lens, that says you do not destroy communities in order to be a convenience to other people. And I think that that's an area that we could collaborate on quite a bit in terms of looking at what this looks like and how it impacts different communities, and really come up with, because like, for instance, one of the things that Deb Howland is being attacked for is the fact that she looks at the land. She's been very outspoken about the land and about the oil industry and and fossil fuel industry and what it has done. And so you've got conservative senators attacking her because, in a sense, that will impact their pocketbooks. And yet we've got to be clear about climate and preservation of our land and spaces that will balance out how we want to grow with things that should be preserved. And I think that's a big issue that can be collaborative on that.
Beautiful. Wow. I mean, thank you for drawing that connection. And I think you illuminate also, like, environmental justice and reproductive justice are interlinked, right? Yeah. Like, and the ways in which our land and our bodies become capitalized on, right, are also interlinked. So thank you for offering that to us as a place to reimagine where collaboration can occur. Corinne or Jessica?
Yeah, I think the multiplicity of our lives make that we need each other, right? Any ecosystem is dependent on all the species, the plants, the animals, the waters, the air. We're interconnected, and there's no way for us to avoid that. What we're seeing in this culture of violence, what we're seeing in this white supremacist, capitalistic world is that they've tried to silo us. They've tried to separate us out. They've tried to divide us. And that's the way they manage things, right? Separating the water from the land and the air. So separating, men from women, so we have all of this separation by race, gender, class. And I think our role has always been, as women, to really voice the multiplicity of our existence, and that we are not just one thing. We are not just in one place at one time. Simultaneity is like the reality of our life. My mother talks about this, Elder Kathy talks about this, the fluidity of our connections, and that we need to recognize that, wherever we're eating, that food came from somewhere. If it's not coming from our local economy, in our communities, it's coming from outside in other people's local communities. And we look at the farm workers, we look at these essential workers that people are discarding, and not necessarily really fully understanding how this connection happens to how we get to have corn on our shelves in the supermarket. And really where that comes from is indigenous communities across the globe that have been exploited, right, for their seeds, for their farmland, the disposition of peoples across this globe of their land base. And is what we're talking about when we talk about land back movements for indigenous peoples.
Yes.
When we talk about dehumanizing slavery and all of the economy that we're based on, that capitalism and the global economy, right? And so again, there are so many ways for us to interconnect, to braid together in our Opeti way, from environmental justice, education. We still have children in cages. Where's the outrage from all of us about that? Because we should be learning from our shared experience around slavery, around encampments, right? We have this history in America that people forget, that the encampment of people has always occurred, and that we've had 24 presidents who supported genocide, right? And so it's a history that is still there, but it's also an erasure for us in voicing that our lived experiences, people silencing our stories. And so reclaiming that and really having that ability to connect. We worked on environmental justice issues with our Black community. My sister, Marquita Bradshaw, ran for senator in Tennessee on an environmental justice platform, which we would have not seen, I don't think, prior years before. And so just amazing work that I feel I grew up in my role in organizing, in activism, around this multicultural, multiracial. My parents have been really strong about that connection, that we are connected as Indigenous people, as Tewatoa, to our land, but we are also connected in our relationality, in our relativeness with our brothers and sisters of all races, of all classes, of all genders, of all sexualities. And our very survival is dependent on that. And so any way that we can collaborate on reproductive justice issues on a state level, on a local level, on a national level, we need to. The violence against Native women's movement wouldn't have gotten to the level if it wasn't for other advocates and allies. I want to say allies, I want to say friends and relatives that really helped to uplift our voice, to get those passages of laws. Environmental degradation that is continuing to happen is coming from the kitchen table, from our aunts, our mothers who are seeing that degradation and voicing it, who are looking at breast milk. So Gaji Cook from Akwesasne, like really seeing that interconnection and learning. And our doula project wouldn't have been born without those Indigenous midwives that were working so hard to bring this issue to our communities and who are willing to share. And also I want to say our Black and Latina midwives, curanderas, healers in our community. Without that connection, we wouldn't be able to reclaim a lot of what has been genocided out of us, that memory and that erasure. And so I think those connections are vital to our survival. And the pandemic is highlighting that for us, right? As we're isolated and separated from each other, how much that social interaction is really the breath of who we are in our communities, and that we need each other in order to survive. The white supremacists have learned that, right? Because they try to separate us out and not allow us to do that. And so we need to reclaim our relative and relationship to each other.
Yes, and to the land, right? As you named.
And to the land.
What you described, Jessica, I'm excited to have you come in, because what you describe also is like this trickle downing of like the tradition of elder midwifery. For Black people, it's granny midwifery, Indigenous midwifery, right? Like there's this through line that continues to inform our contemporary work. That's like, yes, if the proper foods, if the proper environments, if the proper landscapes, the climate, right, all of that is not in alignment, then and even capitalism informs, right, like our perinatal outcomes. And I think people really need to grasp that, like all the way down, it always informs and determines like what our bodies go through. And I want to turn to you, Jessica, to think about with us just like what the resiliency strategies have been during COVID, because COVID was not a new issue for us, right? COVID actually exacerbated for Black and Indigenous communities economic injustice, climate injustice, food sovereignty, right? Like housing dignity. That COVID just exacerbated what we already were seeing at the intersection of maternal health, at the intersection of perinatal health, right? So what have you garnered? What have you seen? And how, what strategies have your communities been using to be responsive to this exacerbation of conditions?
I think that what I've seen first and foremost is a coming together and a strength and a leaning on each other in ways that we did before, but is stronger now. Although we're all separated through this virtual world and on our computers, I feel like the conversations that we're having are deeper. I feel like, the reliance on each other to make sure that there's food on the tables of our new parents, to make sure that, people are still having access to farm fresh foods, that people are still able to connect with each other when their hearts are hurting. Like that, I feel like has just gotten deeper and deeper. We have seen a lot of injustices here, particularly in New Mexico through COVID. Last year in Lovelace Hospital, we saw the separation of Indigenous parents from their newborns just based upon their zip code and the area that they were from. And we were able to, through the connections with our friends and our allies and our sister organizations, come together to really speak out against those injustices and demand that there's a shift and a change. We've also been able to really come together to talk about hospital policies that were enacted and created without the voices of community, through the work with our friends at Bold Futures, Black Health New Mexico Birth Equity Collaborative, to really talk about, what is most important to us and to our families, and how people are giving birth here in New Mexico, especially during COVID. I think that when I look at all of the things that have already been said, all of these policies are put in place to divide us, to make us feel tired and exhausted, and we're constantly fighting the battle just to have our voices heard in the seats at the table. And what I have seen come together more so in the last year is people saying, let me lift this up so that you're not the only person at this table asking for a seat here. Particularly with the Maternal Mortality Review Board, how do we make sure that it's not just one Black advocate sitting at that table representing all people of color? How do we make sure that, there's many of us coming together to say, wait a second, this whole system needs to shift and change? How do we uplift those words of the people that we care about to make sure that the things that are really important to us are being heard? And then I think too, how do we come together in joy? Corinne was talking about joy the other day, and I just think about that. COVID has made us all so, it has exacerbated the problems, but it's also how do we really find that connection and that joy with each other? How do we uplift that heart space? When we're not able to sit at a table across from each other, how do we still have dance parties? And how do we still have that connection and that joy that brings us that resiliency in those practices? To me, that's something that I think it's not talked about a lot, but it's something that is the undercurrent, right? It's the undercurrent of our movement, is that joy and is that healing. And it is so, so important. And it's something that they're not going to take away from us.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. Corinne, do you have something more to say about that?
Sometimes we get lost in the policy, and I think policy is important, most definitely. And I think the place around healing and healing justice, right, and how that interweaves with all of these justices that we're trying to achieve, gender justice, environmental justice, reproductive justice, that spiritual connection. When I think of our peoples that have faced the darkest moments of their lives in this country, that the spiritual activism, the spiritual rootedness is really what's gotten us through. And that neighborly acts of supporting one another, of hiding people, right? If that was the basic thing that we could do, which was a huge vulnerability and most courageous act, how can we uplift and hold more of that in our communities? We can achieve, we have shown that we can achieve the policy wins. How do we continue to nurture each other's spiritual connection and spiritual being in that process? When Deb was up there for that nomination and that interrogation, it was like trying to send as much spiritual energy and prayers that we could so that her spirit could withstand what was coming to her, right? And when we think about our vice president, our leaders, whether they're male, female, transgender, that we're giving them the energy and the courage to continue to move forward. And I think for us as BIPOC communities, that's our strength. That's one of the most powerful things that we have. And how can we continue to make sure that we're honoring that for our relatives, for those that have laid their lives down, and that we don't forget.
Thank you for that. Marcella, anything to add on that?
Just that I think that for all of us, this COVID did something that that brought us together more. And one would think because we couldn't see, we couldn't be in the same room or anything, that would make us feel apart from each other. And I think the thing that has happened with BIPOC people is that we basically come up with a way building community across this virtual world. And it really has been uplifting in that sense. And I think because like I'm one of those introverts. I love being by myself, but I also know that for people that I work with who are much more extrovert, that being alone in your house all the time has been very difficult. And so one of the things that we try to do is have that piece of joy. Like, how do you do that? You know, do we just get on our stuff and start playing some music and watching people dance around and really interact with each other and believing that one of the things, like we work a lot with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum and the National Latina Institute. And part of that collaborative that we have together is basically one of our pieces is to have each other's backs. So I was, when I think it was Jessica who mentioned this thing about how people want to have a Black person at the table and they think, okay, all women of color are here. And one of the things that we started doing in meetings, even, you know, before COVID, in meetings that were with national women's organizations in DC, is I would walk in the room, and if I didn't see Miriam or Jessica, I would say, did you invite Latina Institute and NAPOF? And they would say the same thing when they went into a room. And after a while, of course, we would walk in and people would automatically say, well, Jessica was invited, but she couldn't come. And, you know, they just started like before we even said anything. And that was what we did to make sure that people understood that we had each other's backs and that I could not speak for all women of color. And they could not assume that a room with, you know, 20 white women in it and me meant they had reached out to communities of color when they had not. And so it was that kind of piece. And recently in a room that we were talking about, which we started talking about Native and Indigenous people and why they weren't in the room as well. And that was in an environmental discussion again that we were having around heat and the impact of heat on maternal health and what that means and stuff. And so and I think that that's the kind of stuff that has come out of the COVID response pieces that we need to keep up, is to make sure that when we're talking about essential workers, essential workers are not just doctors, nurses, firefighters. Essential workers are the people who are providing the food we eat, who are in the fields. There was a news piece in California where they were talking about housing that was for farm workers, and the fact that their housing, you know, literally 5 and 6 people were in one small apartment because it was seasonal housing because of what they were doing out in the fields and picking. It was strawberries, actually. And the fact that none of them had been offered COVID vaccines. People had not even come there yet to offer vaccines. And they were doing a whole series on that. The fact that these people were living, and they weren't family, they were living in these smaller houses because it was seasonal work and these were the housing they had. And yet no one from the health industry had come out to say, it's here, we've got your vaccines and stuff. And that's the kind of things where I think our communities have suffered because many states don't actually look at COVID numbers by race. And because if they did, they found out how they're not being equitable at all. And that's part of this whole thing about what COVID has brought up. It basically just shows it just exacerbates our healthcare system but also our working system, our wage issues.
Yes.
It has exacerbated all of this stuff that we now have to figure out how to solve, how to fix
Yes.
before, you know, everybody gets vaccinated and we're back to doing business as usual, instead of really resolving some of these things that have emerged.
Right. Wow. You just kind of like pulled us into this current moment and how, you know, what your reactions have had to be in responses, you know, to the vaccination as a political issue. And I think it really reveals how it intersects again across sectors. And I want to just leave us, there's a question in the chat that I want to lift up, and it would take a whole other hour. So I want to give our panelists an opportunity to close on this question, right? Like final thoughts, trying to get us out of here in 3 minutes, which feels so impossible, but it's been rich tonight. And that question is around how we counter resistance, right? And this particular question that's coming into the chat is about religions, social power, patriarchal religion, and you know, the opposition that comes with that. But just in general, how are you countering resistance? And I heard Jess talk about joy, and I heard us talk about policy, and I heard us talk about honoring our ancestors and our ritual practices. Like, what does your practice of resistance look like that is centered in an affirmation of your community? If you could just give us that as we close tonight. How are you resisting? How does it center the strengths of your community?
Wow.
I can, if it's okay, I can start and then leave it to you all, because for me, it's really simple. For us, it's the birth of every baby that comes through. It's the advocacy for every person who is seeking reproductive health care, regardless of where it falls upon the spectrum. And for me, every single time somebody is able to have those needs met, like that's countering, that's the resistance, that's the joy, and the breath, right? Like if we can just come back to our breath in like the hardest moments, in the easiest moments, in our first moments, and we just offer that gratitude and that thank you. For me, that's where it falls personally. So thank you all for this conversation.
Thank you, Jessica. Corinne, Marcella.
For me, I think it's sharing. It's being able to share experiences that we're all going through every day, as a way of sort of what's the right word? Validation. Yeah, that's it. Validating our experiences, because I think the last year has been just a strange thing, not just with COVID, but with racial justice protests, with attempts to overthrow the government. I mean, all kinds of things. And the fact that, well, where I don't expect that Biden and Harris are going to solve all problems, the fact that on the afternoon of the January 20th, I realized that I exhaled, that I had not been that I had been walking around constantly catching my breath, as more and more atrocities happen in these last 4 years. And that all of a sudden it was just, you know how you have those little headaches right in the center of your head? The headache was gone. And it was like, it'll probably come back at some point as, the administration doesn't do what I want it to do. But it had disappeared. And when I started talking to other people, they were saying, yeah, I woke up this morning and that neck pain I had was gone, and that pain I had in my back was gone. And we really did talk a lot about those extra, like, kind of that had been there for 4 years, and sort of like they were just not there anymore. And you kind of think, God, if we could have that all the time, how do we keep that and see our vision for the future of our communities sort of in that positive frame, and really know that if we share that with each other, if we're back there again, having each other's backs, that everything's possible.
Yes. Wow. Karine, to close us, and then I'll pass it to Annette.
Wow. I'm like, thank you all. I feel like the resistance is our existence. And that being also our healing. You know, I think COVID has really uplifted for me the healing that I need to come back to in my own community, in my own family, right? Because we say like we're mirrors to this world. So if we're doing this work, it's impacting myself and my family. And then I'm able to then mirror that out in this broader work that we do. And because we don't have the ability to separate for ourselves, in my family pod, it's like really looking at those relationships and those places of healing that still need to happen. Because I know as it happens there, it's going to happen in my work, and it's going to happen in my coalition work, and it's going to happen in that broader sphere. So, and the resistance is our existence. And I think about my nieces and my nephews and the other kids that are also struggling, and that they need to know that we are still here, that we are still fighting, and that we are still holding them in the center of our work.
Shay, thank you so much.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, please, Marcella.
This is just to thank you, Savannah, for bringing me Corinne and Jessica and Annette. I mean, I am so thrilled to meet you and to be able to be in this space with you, and therefore I'm not letting you go. It's really that simple.
Believe Marcella on that one. You know, thank you, Marcella, for that affirmation. This has been powerful, and you know, there's work to do, right? We want to uplift the Momnibus bill that currently in the House and the Senate was introduced by Lauren Underwood, Congresswoman Alma Autumn, Senator Cory Booker, and also members of the Black Maternal Health Caucus, which yes, we have a Black Maternal Health Caucus, is aiming to eliminate maternal health inequities and disparities like maternal mortality and morbidity. We're really excited about that. And of course, right, it's crucial that we remove Hyde Amendment, right? We also have a commitment to protecting Roe v. Wade at the state and national levels. There's still work to do. Policy work is still there, right? Yep. So, you know, and I know that Corinne and Jessica and Marcella are leading that work from the front, you know? So thank you all. It's just been such an honor. Thank you. I want to invite Annette to come in and just close us out. We could stay all night, but Annette, help us get home.
I know we can really stay all night and listen. And I am just so amazed and overwhelmed by all these wonderful women. And all I could think of was the women as elders, as wise women. And I'm going to interject a story real quick. There was a snake in my storage unit. And so this girl from Poland came to get it out. And she said, well, I'm not afraid of snakes. There are not too many snakes. And then she told me this beautiful story. She said, you know, you can light a candle at the church, but you might need to go down to the end of the village and talk to the wise woman. And that story has always stuck with me. And I think listening to you wise women today has given me hope. And I hope they propel us to action. And please be on the lookout for more information of our upcoming event in the series, Gender Equality as the Law of the Land, the work to pass the ERA on March 11th. And thank you all for attending. And I hope y'all have a good night and a wonderful weekend and a wonderful month and a wonderful year. So thank you again. Clap.